I try not to have favorites, but the abort controller makes that hard. Each of the Node globals, those objects that are available in any module in Node, over and above the built-in JavaScript internals, bring useful functionality to our fingertips. And the abort controller solves a problem that has existed for a long time now. Hi, I'm Kevin, and in this video we're going to explore the problem the abort controller solves and some examples of it doing just that. To do that though, we'll have to dive into, or at least dip our toes into promises. Promises are the main way we deal with asynchronous operations in modern JavaScript. Whether that's calling out to a database, making a network request, opening a file, or anything else which might take some unknown amount of time. Using a promise, we hand over responsibility for those operations and keep going with our program, coming back to get the data or the response when the operation is finished. Promises have a secret though. Unlike your favorite Netflix show, they are uncancellable, or at least they were. So if your user changes their mind and makes a second, third, or fourth network request or data lookup, what do? Well, you probably ignore the response of the previously initiated promise and start a new one. The problem is that those ignored promises are still taking up resources. Not a big deal with one user or 3 requests, but maybe more of an issue with thousands of users and thousands of requests. Even worse though is if the promise doesn't resolve or reject at all, it just stays in a pending state forever. Maybe an API opens a connection but then never responds. Without the ability to cancel this operation, it will stay taking up system resources until the whole node process is restarted. Enter the abort controller. We get 2 things with the abort controller, a signal and an abort method. The signal can be passed into as many promises as we like. We then attach an event listener to that signal, waiting for an abort event. The abort method can then be used by other parts of our code to cancel any promises listening to its associated signal, cancelling the promise and freeing up the system resources. Let's see it in some code. I have a file called ac.js and I'm going to create a new abort controller. So this abort controller has a signal, and I can add event listeners to this signal. In particular, I'm going to add an event listener that will respond to the abort event. And all I'll do is log aborted. Next, I will invoke the abort method, and then hopefully I get that message. Brilliant. The signal also has an aborted boolean attached to it, which will be false before it's aborted and true after. So let's see that in action. False before and true after. Okay, we can see we have a signal, we can attach an event listener to it, and invoking the abort method triggers that event. Let's see it in the context of a promise. I'm going to create a new promise, and a promise will have my resolve and reject, and I'm going to move my adding the event listener inside of that promise. And instead of just console logging, I'm going to reject with that message. Otherwise, I'm going to use a set timeout, and I'm going to resolve with promise resolved, and I'll do that after 100 milliseconds. So first off, I'm just going to comment this out and just check that the promise resolves after 100 milliseconds. Well, it does, but we don't do anything with the data. So let's add it then. So .then data, console log the data. Brilliant, the promise has resolved. What happens if I abort then? If I abort, I get an unhandled rejection, an unhandled promise rejection. So I need a .catch. So .catch, if there's an error, I'll just console log that error. Brilliant. So this promise is now set for 100 milliseconds, it does something, and then it resolves. But this could be an API request. It could be some other database request or slow running function that actually, if it doesn't come back in time, we want to abort it. What would this look like in an async function? Pretty similar, but let's have a look. I'm going to have an async function and I'll call it a cancellable promise, and it's going to receive the signal. And initially, all I'm going to do is move everything here inside of there. And instead of ac.signal, just have my signal. So then I'll invoke my cancelable promise and I'll pass in my signal. So all being well, this should do exactly the same thing. It just should say aborted. Brilliant. And if I comment that out, it should say promise resolved. Amazing. It's doing what I'm expecting. But I'm not really liking how this looks. So instead of using .then, I'm going to capture that data in a variable and then log it out here. So console.log my data here. And I don't want this .catch just for now. We'll have to think about that in a second. So this should say promise resolved in the same way. Brilliant. What about when I abort it? Unhandled rejection. That makes sense. I got rid of that .catch. So I'm going to use a try catch. And I'll move this block into my try. And I'll console log my error. So it works in exactly the same way. I've got my try catch. I'm passing my signal into my promise. And then some other part of my code can cancel that and move things forward. Most of Node's promise-based APIs have now been built to accept these signals. And the one that you'll use most often probably is the fetch API. So let's see what this would look like using a fetch API. So this time I'll have an async function which is going to print some GitHub data and it will accept a signal as before. And it's largely going to look the same. So we'll try catch and we'll console log the error. So I'll say const response is going to await fetch and we fetch api.github.com/user. Now fetch takes a configuration object as a second parameter and I'm going to pass the signal into that. So once I've got the response, I'll convert the data. So data equals await response.json and then I'll log it. So console log the data. Well, let's invoke it first of all without aborting it. So we'll pass in the signal anyway and we'll see what happens. Oh, users. There we go. So we get the first 10 users that GitHub provides our API ready to go. Now, if I have an incorrect URL, I get something, not found, message not found. Like, what's that about? Actually, that's part of an error. And it's worth remembering that the fetch API doesn't count a 404 or any non-200 response as a problem. So we should always have an if not response okay, just throw an error and we should say something like problem with request. And then we can do the pass back the response.status text. Problem with request not found. That's probably a slightly better experience than it just printing back the response. So what happens when we abort? Let's try aborting. And this time we get a DOM exception, abort error, the operation was aborted. So what that allows us to do is we can check if the error name is abort error. We can do something that's specifically for an aborted operation. So we might say the operation was aborted, else log in some other way. Equally, we might decide not to log this out at all. It might just be a quiet move on, ignore it. It got aborted, we're fine. We're not going to throw any kind of error. We're not going to do any kind of logging. So now we log this out, we can say the operation was aborted. And if we're failing silently or if we're doing something silently, then it's fine. It got aborted. Nothing need to be said about it. This is the code for the fetch API inside of Node. I want to show you how it aborts. So first of all, it checks whether or not the signal that it might get passed in is aborted. And if it does, it invokes this abort fetch request. We're going to look at that in a second. But before we do that, I want to just have a look at another thing. Here, on the signal, it adds an event listener for the abort event and then uses a function. This is exactly what we did in our code. It's happening in Node internals. And again, it invokes this abort fetch. And what does abort fetch do? If we go to its definition, all it does is check whether or not if there wasn't a DOM exception error, and rejects the promise that is built around this entire request. So we're attaching to the signal an event listener that's listening to the abort and then rejecting the promise, exactly what we did in our code. Well, hopefully you've got a glimpse of the power of the Abort controller and can begin to love it as much as I do. Let me know if you find this helpful, and if you've got more examples of the Abort controller being used in your project or projects you've worked with, then comment down below. Thanks. Bye.